Hello YouTube. This will probably be the last installment on the S1A teardown series I did. Because I've got the camera pretty much all back together. I've just got to put the body pieces on. It's all very simple. Front just screws on, top just basically screws on. Got to take this stuff back off. Put the cover on and put all the stuff back together where it was, and put the bottom plate on after I hook up the two flash wires. I guess the whole point here is I'm just going to cover a few things, and that'll be it until I film test it. I may do a quick video on that just to show everybody how well I did or did not. So in summary, and this will be a little bit repetitive because I covered most of this in the other videos. I've got the new shutter curtains I made are in. I printed the instruction manual, the actual Pentax instruction manual, and use that as my guide to disassemble, and the disassembly instructions are pretty clear and easy to follow. As I said in the last video, reassembly is somewhat different. They cover all the areas where adjustment is required, but all of the peripheral stuff, they don't say, okay, now is the time to install this or that. There was a big explanation how to install and adjust the gearing down here for the idler gears, and there's a couple other gears that need to be set in a specific manner. It doesn't tell you to install the main shaft, which runs from the top of the body to the bottom of the body and ends up down there with all the stuff in here that makes everything else work. My experience was that you need to be prepared to follow your own disassembly instructions backwards for reassembly, and basically do what you did in the same order, just in reverse. I wound up having to readjust. There's two idler gears here, if you can see them. I wound up having to take this gear off and tweak these gears around counterclockwise to get it one tooth over further than it was, in order for what is called the spill in here to work properly. Because what was happening was my film advance was locked, and that was because that little tiny spill gizmo wasn't falling into its proper slot, and if that thing couldn't fall into its proper slot, nothing turns. So I had to fiddle with that, and it was just one tooth on those tiny little gears that I had to turn it. I mentioned before, there's a lot of springs in here that really need to be in place, or you're going to be so very sorry. So you need to keep very good track of all springs. I recommend having a parts camera for reference that's in one piece, or mostly in one piece. It's also good for replacing anything you might strip or break or lose, which is what I did on 2 or 3 occasions. I broke one threaded stud that I had to replace, lost a couple of springs, and I think one screw. So that's what my parts camera was for. On the underside here, let's see if I can prop this up a little bit better than it is. Under here, there's a process for adjustment of this cam, this lever, all of this stuff. There's a process for it. Again, it doesn't tell you when to install all the extra stuff that isn't being adjusted. You just have to plan on installing it and doing your adjustments accordingly. There's a relationship with the edge of this arm, and there's an edge, you probably can't see it, but there's an edge in the body right behind it. They have to be parallel, and you adjust that by turning this gear around. It also, on the other side of this gear that you can't see from this angle, there's a pin that has to hit this arm, and that is for your low speed cam. That all of this stuff in its roundabout way connects to the clockwork that sets your low speed timing from, oh, what is it, 1 second to a 15th. After that, as I understand it, it goes to the high speed cam, which is up in here underneath your speed selector switch. So when I got it all together, I discovered that that pin was too high, so it wasn't engaging my low speed arm. So again, I had to take out the screw, and I had to do this from the wound position. The film advance the shutter had to be cocked to get this out of the way. Then I could take that screw out, and I could move that gear around a tooth or two at a time until I got it in the correct position, meaning that when the stud was here, like it is now, that these two lines were parallel, and that when it was in a cocked position, that stud that's on the other side of this gear was underneath this tiny little arm. Now, ultimately, I'm having some trouble with the low speed. I can't seem to make all the parts work together. High speed seems okay. The shutter speeds seem pretty correct. But the low speed, it just isn't working between a second and a 15th. I'm assuming that I made a mistake somewhere, but I just don't know. And I think I'm going to live with it because I rarely, if ever, use the low speeds anyhow. The manual goes into great detail on setting the shutter speed, and not just setting the shutter speed, but the actual shutter speed, the time that the shutter speed takes to cross from one side to the other. I don't have the equipment to measure that, so I'm just going to assume that it's pretty close, and I'm going to live with it the way it is. I didn't replace any of the geared parts. So everything has worn in together. There's nothing that the instructions say if you're replacing this or you're replacing that, this is what you need to do, and I didn't replace anything with new parts. Over here, there's a gear right there, and that not only engages one of the shutter curtains, but it works your flash sync, and there's a anti-bounce back, at least that's what they call it, anti-bounce back arm and related arm that have to work together. When I went to do that adjustment, I realized that because I did not disassemble this portion, I had to take this out, and then again take that little E-clip off and physically pick that gear up off of its post and turn it until it got into the right position, because the instructions give you a measurement for a gap between, there's a little, I don't know what you'd call it, lip on that gear that engages this portion of this arm, and there's a given measurement from the two sides that are working, and I had to remove the gear and then just tweak it around until I got it where it was supposed to be. And the reason I had to do all that is because the instructions assume that you are doing a complete disassembly. All this stuff is out, everything. I did not do that. There's a few things I didn't take apart. I didn't take this apart, and I didn't take the bottom plate out. And there was a couple other things because they weren't relevant to what I was doing, and I didn't want to create any more extra work. I'm not sure if I did myself any favor or not, but I got it back together, and I took the extra time to fix things that I didn't get right the first time. And it was a lot of fooling around. It was a lot of tweaking and twitching and kind of figuring things out as I went along. They don't tell you that curtains or related gears should be in this or that position with an actual diagram. They give you a kind of a diagram with what they call the relative position of this or that. And maybe somebody with an engineering background, or who, I don't know, is just better put to this stuff, would make more sense of that. To me, it was difficult to follow. And of course, it doesn't tell you before doing this you have to install that. The manual is certainly for people who already know what they're doing. I'm not sure what else to tell you about this. I don't want to repeat myself any more than I already have. The disassembly, looking back now, was not that complicated. It was pretty straightforward. It's fairly simple, as long as you have some small screwdrivers, both magnetic and otherwise, a loop, and free time and patience. It took a couple hours to get it down to where I needed it to be. Considerably longer to get it back together because it was a learning curve. I don't know that I would hesitate to do another one if I really wanted to, but by the same token, I wouldn't dive into the next one without giving it some thought. So anyhow, to keep this under an hour, this is it. It works. The shutter speeds seem about as accurate as I'm going to get, because as I said, I just don't have the equipment to test these things properly. And once I get it back together, I'm going to take it out in the field and see what happens. So wish me luck, and see you next time.